Today we are gonna look at how was the life in the 19th century in England. Life in the 19th century was much different from the life today. People flocked to the cities to work in the new industries. By the late 19th century, all kinds of people lived in the cities. Laborers and servants were the most numerous. Although some became better off, many were still poor. They lived in cramped, decaying houses, known as slums. Shop and office workers formed a lower middle class, while lawyers, doctors and factory owners made up an upper middle class. People lived in different areas of the city according to their wealth. Rich people had several servants, kept a carriage and wore fine clothes. They lived as far away as possible from factories and poor areas. Poverty. Many towns grew rapidly into large, bustling cities. Because so many people moved to the cities for work, there were often too few buildings for them to live in. Many people lived in terrible poverty. Most lived close to their factories, with whole families sharing 1 or 2 rooms. There was no running water, water had to be collected from a public tap. Instead of flushing toilets, many people had to use cesspits, which were emptied infrequently. Children often shared beds. During the Victorian era, efforts were made to improve public health by better sanitation. Sewage works, where waste is treated, were improved, and so was the quality of drinking water. Despite these efforts, there were outbreaks of deadly diseases in the city slums. In 1848-9, for example, an epidemic of cholera, which is spread by poor sanitation, broke out in London, killing 14,137. Factories and workhouses. Factory life was extremely hard. Factories were noisy and crowded, with no toilets. The hours were long. Women and children worked in the factories and in mines because their families needed the money. Young boys sometimes worked as chimney sweeps, climbing up chimneys with brushes to clean them. Other children worked as street sellers, errand boys, and shoe cleaners. Luckier working-class children were taken on as apprentices to learn a trade or became servants. The poorest people, who could not support themselves, had to live and work in workhouses. Fashion. Only wealthier people could afford to follow fashion in Victorian times. Women in fashionable society wore corsets and padding to mold their figures into the ideal shape. From the 1850s to the 1870s, they wore frames called crinolines underneath their dresses to make their skirts wide and bell-like. In the 1870s, this fashion was replaced by the bustle, which held their skirts up behind. From the 1880s, women opted for a slimmer skirt. Respectable women and men wore hats when outdoors, suits with waistcoats. By the end of the Victorian era, clothes were often made in factories using sewing machines, rather than hand-stitched by seamstresses and tailors, and then sold in department stores. A wealthy home. In a well-off Victorian house, the upper floors were taken up by the servants' quarters and by the children's nurseries. The children rarely saw their parents. Instead, they were looked after most of the time by their nanny. She oversaw the children's meals, washing, lessons, and playtime. Children from well-to-do homes had plenty of toys and games. Other children played hoop rolling and other games in the street. The drawing room was where the well-to-do entertained their guests. Only the houses of wealthy people had bathrooms in Victorian times. Before bathrooms were common, servants carried a bathtub up to a bedroom and filled it with hot water from downstairs. The kitchen of a wealthy Victorian home was in the basement. It often had a flagstone floor, a large wooden table, and a coal-fired iron oven called a range. There was usually a shallow earthenware sink and piped water. The water was warmed using the heat from the oven. There were no refrigerators, so food was placed in ice safe. The impact of the bubonic plague epidemics of the past still echo across the centuries, reminding us of the devastation that disease can inflict on communities. Smallpox and vaccination are intimately connected. Edward Jenner developed the first vaccine to prevent smallpox infections, and this success led to the global eradication of smallpox and the development of many more life-saving vaccines. While many infectious diseases began to decline by the end of the 1800s, incidence of polio increased to epidemic proportions.